Thank you so much for having us, and to Stephen at Point Reyes Books for having us tonight. And I'm very grateful for Camille for agreeing to have this conversation with me. It's such a complete pleasure for me to be in conversation with Camille, whose work I very much admire and have for a long time. And welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. I know, being a remote worker, how hard it is to be on a Zoom all day and then come to an evening Zoom, especially on a Monday evening. So I so appreciate you for joining. I think we're just going to start out by me doing a brief reading from the opening of the book, which I think gives an overview of the main concerns in the book. So I will do that. It's a section called Gift, and it starts with an epigraph from Rebecca Solnit. I wanted to trace the lost patterns that came before the world was broken and find the new ones we could make out of the shards. The thing turned up in a corner of the yard, just outside the fence. I found it when I went out to take Quincy for a walk. Curved and black, plastic, 4 feet long, a foot at its widest. I thought at first it was a car bumper. I put it in the grass by the porch. The next morning, it was still there. I sat next to it in the sun and looked closely. It was not the first piece of plastic junk I had sat staring at. For nearly a year, I'd been picking up all the plastic I found on my daily dog walk. I'd been arranging it into patterns, taking photographs. I'd been storing it all up in plastic garbage bags on the back porch. I didn't know exactly why I was doing this. I wanted to understand something. Plastic on the dog walk, plastic on visits to the beach, plastic studding the ground everywhere I looked. I gathered it all up. I am the no and the yes. A line from the poet Hannah Sobelman's first book. It has lived with me for years, sometimes whispering through my mind in its old remembered rhythm. In the poem, Sobelman follows the line with a qualifying phrase. She narrows it, makes it domestic. But I want the raw declaration hanging there on the turn of itself. I am the no and the yes. For nearly half my life, I've worked for an environmental group. I spend most of my days in front of a computer screen, taking in a deluge of information about planetary trauma and emergency. Most of it floods through me, too vast to grasp. But plastic was a shard that stuck. Plastic I could touch, and it could touch me back. I dragged the car part inside the house. Nearly 10 years later, it sits beside me near my desk. I learned this, that the world is not broken, or that it has always been shards, kaleidoscopically interwoven. Not one world, many, threaded through one another, like fungus hyphae through soil. Worlds end. As Catherine Yusof points out, in a billion black Anthropocenes or none. Some worlds have ended over and over, lives consumed and discarded by individuals woven into systems that give them life and death power. Like settler colonialism, like capitalism. These are systems built by humans, but they exceed individuals. They extend across generations and geographies, planet-scale forces of destruction. Plastic waste stems from this consume and dispose violence. I learned that waste is not an unintended consequence of a miracle new technology. Waste is inherent in plastic production as it accelerated after World War II. In 1945, days before the US military incinerated 2 cities with atomic bombs, a DuPont executive looked forward to the end of the war and the surge of buying that would follow as soldiers returned home and bought houses and cars, washing machines, and refrigerators. The job ahead, he told a group of marketing experts, see to it that Americans are never satisfied. Plastic embodies this infinite desire. conjured out of gas and oil, the seemingly endless reservoirs of dead plants and animals underlying Earth. Plastic transmutes death into eternal life. The word plastic refers not to any specific object, just the quality of a material, that it is capable of taking shape, an endless stream of shapes. Objects formed from plastic ease suffering and save lives, artificial hearts, IV bags, the tubes snaking out of a respirator. Plastic makes cars safer, airplanes lighter, and delivers drinking water. The single largest use of plastic, though, is for containing other objects. 40% of plastic goes into packaging to be used once and then discarded, driving endless demand for more. Companies work to keep these facts hidden. When the evidence becomes too overwhelming, plastic clogging roadsides, oceans, living bodies, companies shift responsibility onto individuals through things like anti-littering campaigns and ensure that taxpayers and municipalities pay the tab for managing the waste. The lives harmed at every step, human and non-human, drop out of the equation. The same consume and dispose violence threads through me also. It has benefited me my whole life. I grew up the daughter of a nuclear physicist in Los Alamos, the town that built the atomic bombs, which ended some lives in order to save others perceived to have more value. We are woven into the same net, me and bombs and this car part. For a decade, I followed threads that tie us together through airplanes and sailors, the hydrogen bomb, Pacific Islands, the Nazis, and Heidegger. I followed threads through silence, loss, and grief, through the birth of chemistry and the invention of radar, through patriarchy, empire, and chattel slavery. I followed threads through apologies and their failure, through a pandemic and an uprising, and living lungs struggling to breathe, through old wounds and new ones, hurt reverberating, aching to be remembered. This object, a book and its journeys, this broken down car part, its life. This is my no. I have wanted this car part and its entanglements, often ugly ones and painful, to leave me. I have wanted not to have to face, in my privilege, the terms of its existence. I learned this. There is nowhere to go. The same terms that made this piece of plastic made me, my own body, and each of my breaths. This is also, it must be, my yes. Thanks for that.
Thank you, Allison.
Yes.
Oh, wow. It's such a, we haven't shown the good people this book, right? It's like it's a big book with a sizable note section. So even though you announce yourself as an expert towards the end of the book, you really dedicated, as you say, a decade to this research and this study and these strange, winding, interconnected, surprising paths. You take so many journeys in this book. Could you just talk maybe about one that was most surprising to you, a kind of insight about plastic that you didn't expect?
Yeah, I had a few that became kind of turned in the book over that time. And I'll say that, I set out, well, I didn't have any idea what I was doing. I had a very tiny writing group with two close friends, and one day declared that I was going to write the autobiography of plastic. And I feel like then the next 10 years was the process of figuring out what that meant. And it changed. I think really what started to very much propel the book at the end of the book was I wanted to write about the way that plastic pollution is impacting communities where it's produced, because we see a lot about waste, of tragic things about waste inside of marine animals and in the ocean. But there's a woman who runs the Center for International Environmental Law who is called the most invisible part of the plastic pollution problem, the communities that live with it. And so I knew I wanted to do that. And in 2014, I went and visited Freeport, Texas, which is on the Gulf Coast and home to Dow Chemical, which had at the time the largest plastic plant in the world. 2014 was my first visit there. Between 2014 and when I went back and did some longer visits in 2019, fracking technology really took off. So all of this cheap natural gas started flooding the market. And the other thing that happened is that oil companies started seeing the end of the fossil fueled car as electric vehicles start to take over the market, and started really doubling down on plastic as their future profit maker, because their projections for plastic is that consumption is only going to grow around the world as the middle class rises in places like China and India. And they make huge profits off of plastic from cheap, they basically, practically free natural gas, and pour it into these chemical plants. So there's $200 billion of investment going into mostly the Gulf Coast of the US right now, building new plastic plants, including 3 times over the largest plastic plant on the planet, all now in the Gulf Coast. And companies that you associate more with oil are building a lot of them. So ExxonMobil and the Saudi Arabian state oil company are building plastic plants on the Gulf Coast. And when I learned about that build out, that is literally wiping out, in some cases, historically Black communities on the Gulf Coast, that started to really propel the last third of the book, which is called The Lives. And that was, I had no idea when I started the book that kind of build out was going to happen, and that would become such a propelling part of the book. So I'd say that was a surprise.
It is such a infuriating and heartbreaking part of the book. And I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about talking to people, because there were these moments in the book where you spoke about what grief looks like, what apology looks like, what really listening and hearing and becoming an activist might look like. Like, how did you come to writing that kind of instruction, essentially, and how did it change you as you went through that process?
Yeah, well, there were some people who didn't want to talk to me, barely enough, because they were people who had talked to a lot of people and didn't, see any benefit from that. There's a real phenomena that happens among communities that they sort of call overstudied and over-researched and over-activisted, right? Where they get a lot of attention, but actually no material benefit in their lives. And so I was, conscious all the way of coming in with my privilege, as a cis female white woman, with no cultural background in the South. So coming in as a real stranger. And my goal was really, this was my goal through the whole thing, my way into this very amorphous and ubiquitous technology. We say plastic, and we have intimate relationships in our daily lives with plastic, but it also takes so many forms. I find it gets kind of invisible. So my way of anchoring it that's where the autobiography piece came from. I wanted to sort of tie it always to my life and to relationships. So the whole thing about the book was sort of building relationships with the research and the history, but also with people. And so that was my goal going in. And for people who were open to that, I was really focused on, just creating those relationships where I could understand what was happening with them and how they were responding to these challenges, so that I could, not offer or pretend to solve anything, but to just bear witness and share and document and share what I was learning, because there are polls that show that most white people in this country don't know that people of color suffer a much higher amount of pollution in general than white people do. So I think a lot of people aren't totally aware of the build out that's happening in plastic plants either. So I just wanted to bear witness to that. And also, another thing that happened that I didn't expect to happen is that I learned from these communities about how to do the work of dealing with these topics and addressing these topics and maintaining resilience. I'm not going to say hope, but I will say resilience while doing that work. I actually stopped writing the book for a while because part of the process was collecting all the plastic I found on my dog walk every day, and I just got done. And I wrote a different book, a book of environmental mourning. I think of it of poems called After We All Died, cheerily. I had to take that break. But when I came back from the book, that was really, I developed really close relationships with some community members, and really mentor-mentee relationships where I've become a kind of a tutor. A tutee, is that the word? A pupil, and have really learned like how you do this work and how you maintain resilience. And I have a very good friend, the poet and artist, J.D. Pluker, who lives in Houston and is like a 7th generation Houstonian. And they warned me when I came there. They said, don't come down here and be like one of those people from the North and just write about environmental doom. Like, we have lives of beauty and lives of complexity, and you need to bear witness to that too. And so I came away with such joy and such beauty from these relationships and felt so fed by them. So that also was kind of a surprise, and what I learned.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about those communities like Freeport, like Mossville, where you really talk about the damage that these multinational corporations have created, and that all of our dependency on plastic has created. And yet you begin the book with that no and yes, and you end with yes and no, and the kind of push against simply coming in and saying this is a disaster and these are all the problems, and really talking about what is the term that sociologists used. It's like
Dr. Eve Tuck, who's an Indigenous scholar, talks about desire-centered research rather than damage-centered research. And desire is a term that gets to that complexity of all of our humanness and our lives, that, many times we're both complicit and victim and, joyful and despairing. And so that's what she's trying to get at. Yeah.
So what's the role of art there? I mean, can you talk a little bit about how the book is structured and why you have the small sections with lots of titles and how that helps you engage with the material?
Yeah. I've been thinking a lot in the process of writing and publishing this book about issues of legibility, like how one is seen and understood. And this book is I consider it a very poetic, I'm trained as a poet, work of creative nonfiction. And because I'm trained as a poet, and as I say in the book, I'm an inexpert, I'm not a historian, I'm not a sociologist, I'm not a journalist. I really wanted to tell a very personal story and way through this technology that at the same time tried to lay out the really broad stakes for how it's rooted in cultural history and like a Eurocentric cultural history, how it's rooted in colonialism, how it's rooted in all of these other sort of wartime technologies that I came out of and growing up in the town that built the atomic bombs. And so I just felt like, I make jokes about having poetic license. I just felt like I have license to go where I want to go, to draw these kind of meandering and broad connections. And people reading this book, might sort of be like, well, we're starting with a Polish mathematician during World War II. What does that have to do with anything? And my hope is that the reader will, hang on and travel with me long enough to see what it has to do. This is not a book of journalism that delivers a manifesto in a sense. that, you know, it's not 50 things you can do to save the planet, although that is an incredibly inspiring and important book. It's not that. It is much more of a meandering through a life. And to me, that's the fascination with these things, is to find all the complexity and connection and really try to bear witness to it. And that's, for me, is where the art comes in.
Yeah. So I wore this necklace particularly tonight because my father brought it back to me from the Marshall Islands.
Oh.
He did research there. He's a pediatrician, and he went with a group from Brookhaven Institute as a healthcare team to, so this is 1982, 83, very soon after the Bikini Islands were evacuated again, et cetera. And so he was in places where he was speaking directly and working directly with it, in his case, the children and mothers who suffered the fallout of those bombs that may or may not have been purposefully detonated in a way that the fallout would drift over the other atolls. And so I got to that part of the book where you were talking about the Marshall Islands and had this strange feeling like, you know, most non-Marshallese Americans may not have any idea really about the history of the Marshall Islands or the kind of connection of atomic testing in that space. And it was this odd moment of thinking, oh, but I know this place, and I know something else. I about what this history is and what the impact on real people has been. In your Louisiana excavations, I also have connections in Louisiana too. And so I was like, oh, I know Monroe, I know Lake Charles, I know these places, and I know these people. I'm wondering about what it means to write for many audiences, for an audience who might randomly have some connection of knowledge to Hawaii, where you go to visit, or the Marshall Islands, or these areas on the Gulf Coast. And then for people, as you said, who may have no idea about these people and these histories, what were you doing in the book to make sure that you touched both audiences, if that was part of your intention?
Yes. Well, that is amazing to hear about that connection with the Marshall Islands and your cowrie shell necklace. I couldn't tell. It could have been pearls from afar through the Zoom or whatever technology we're on. I couldn't tell. But yeah, so just for people who haven't read the book, one of the kind of early key discoveries I made about plastic is that it was essential to the technology of the thermonuclear bomb. Polyethylene, which was a pretty new plastic in the 50s, had not yet taken over in the form of Tupperware and hula hoops, was essential to making the thermonuclear bomb work, the kind of breakthrough that made it work. And that, of course, was all done at Los Alamos. So again, that was like the connection to my life. And I have to tell you, I frankly did not know much about the testing in the Marshall Islands myself. I had known about it, and I am friends with the Marshallese poet Kathy Jetnell-Kishner, so I sort of knew from her writing and her work, but I learned a lot about it. I myself was, one who needed to be educated. And, I'll tell you, it is terrifying, Camille, to write across this enormous range of topics that I am not an expert in. Like, I write about World War II radar technology history. I spend a lot of time with World War II airplane technology, which I did not expect to do at all. Again, following the threads of where the book took me. And I think I kind of brought that vulnerability. The way that I tried to approach it is to bring that humanness into the book and to just document it as my journey. Like, here I am weaving these threads together, or finding how they're woven together and tracing them as a human being who is not a specialist, but wanting to see how we reweave our lives on a planet, right? That feels like it's very broken and where there's so much damage. So I just let myself be sort of human in doing that, and leaving my traces in a way, you know, trying to show where I'd been and where I got stuck, and you know, to show how the threads can fray at some points. But then also I did feel a real responsibility to be rigorous, both to the lives of people I'd met and to the history. So I also did my very best to, you know, very well research and document what I was writing about, which was part of what makes it a 10-year process to do that work. And I asked for expertise from others. You know, I relied on people like Kathy Jetnell-Kishner, my friends in Houston, people I met. You know, I'm not a journalist trying to be objective, right? Yeah. And so I asked community members and friends and all kinds of people to read the book and help me understand what I wasn't seeing and what my blind spots were. And of course, many are still there, but I also saw the book in many ways and see the book as a collaboration. So,
yeah. Is your necklace a molecule?
I'm so glad you asked. I've probably been playing with it. I found this in a secondhand store. I thought it looked like benzene rings, which are kind of the building block of plastic. I have a friend who also has helped advise me on this book, who's an organic chemist, and she gave me 3 different long chemical names and described why some of these are 6-sided rings like benzene and some are 7 and some are 5. And I was like, I got a C in high school chemistry and stopped there. So that's beyond my understanding, but I really admired their ability to do that.
So it's approaching a benzene ring, a series of benzene rings.
Something like that.
Yeah. So we've talked about what surprised you. We talked about kind of like what your challenges were. Have we talked about what joy you discovered in this process?
Yeah, I mean, a surprising joys all the way along, I think. And I had this experience too in writing my previous book, Greenwood, which is about a cemetery in Brooklyn, New York, where I do the same thing in a way. I start in the cemetery and go let the threads from that historic cemetery draw me all over the world and think about colonialism and Western ideas about nature and the environment. I have just so much joy in discovery and uncovering things. So another early discovery in the book was one of those little plastic things about plastic that kind of lodged in my mind was a piece of plastic from inside an albatross chick. And I'm assuming many people have probably seen albatross pick up like flying fish eggs and other things from the ocean to feed to their chicks. But now a lot of times they're also picking up plastic, bits of plastic, and the chicks get so full of plastic, they can't disgorge it, they can't eat anymore, and they die. And Chris Jordan, the photographer, has taken a series of beautiful but troubling photos of skeletons of albatross chicks with the plastic still intact inside the decaying body. So one of the first of those I saw was taken by a photographer named Susan Middleton, and it had a piece of plastic in it with a World War II Naval Squadron insignia on it. And that just that was so amazing to me. It just stuck in there. And so finally, when I got around to starting to write this book, I looked into it, and it turned out that the captain of that naval squadron was born and raised right down the road from me in Oregon. And I found out this information just like a couple weeks after his wife had died. So I was not able to speak with her. I think she was close to 100, but I was able to speak with his son, heard his son's stories, all kinds of family photos. And that just making those connections was so powerful to me. And the ways that, the research that I was doing was building this net of community and broadening it. I had so much joy learning from my friends and people I met along the Gulf Coast. There's that particular community, the east end of Freeport, Texas, is now facing eminent domain. It's again a historically Black community. It's being pushed out by industry, and so I've been working with the experts in that community to do a series of oral histories, so that history isn't lost. And I get to spend an hour on video speaking with these incredible elders from that community and hearing their stories and their insights. And that, to me, that brings me so much joy. I love that work. So I feel so enriched from writing this book. I'm the one who's gotten all the benefit, and everything else is just gravy.
It's such a, it's so full. I love that you brought up that squadron story. That was just, I found that when I sat down with the book, I just like stayed there and didn't do very much that weekend except for read, which, you know, in COVID days with a small child at home, etc., like that's a thing. If you're able to kind of get me to sit still and really just dive into all of these like fascinating, that like story of the creation of the Honda Odyssey, and like just like so many sort of who knew moments as I was moving through the book. And then sometimes I just got stopped because the information is just hard to digest and hard to kind of take to see again and again. And then something else kind of delightful will happen and I'll catch the wind again. Did you feel when you were writing a kind of, I don't know, is it an obligation or a responsibility to be as like serious as possible as you're delivering this information, but then also this knowledge of disaster fatigue that happens in a reader? And were you kind of consciously playing with that in the book, or is that just, am I just following Allison's mind?
I think I was dealing with my own disaster fatigue in the book and finding my ways out of it. And that I sort of am explicit about in the book in terms of that I, had stopped writing it for a while and that I needed to find my way back in. And so I think that was really pretty organic, that I was finding the ways to continue forward. And it is hard information. And it is really, I think, the incredible activist efforts of communities, and increasingly the more well-resourced nonprofits awakening to this problem that is really making change. But there are literally lives, this is life and death for animals and for people, and
for communities.
And for communities. Yeah. So it's very real. I have to say, Susan Middleton, the amazing photographer who took the picture of that albatross with the World War II piece of plastic inside it, is here. So I'm so pleased to see that. And other experts and friends from Houston, JD they're here too. So thank you all for being here.
I feel like I have time for one more question, and then we'll get to Q&A from this wonderful audience. So just audience, as you get ready, you can put your question either in the chat or in that little Ask a Question tab, and I will try and toggle between the two as I bring your questions forward to Allison. I think my question, I always like to ask this of writers and artists. What do you think people are not going to ask about when they ask you or are talking about this book that you really want to make sure does get out there, that people know about the process of writing it or something that's in it?
That is such a good question, Camille. I love it. Stalling as I think about the No, I think so. It's what's kind of fun for me is that when people find out I'm writing a book about plastic, they kind of like put their water bottles behind their backs, or or like, and I always want to make people feel at ease because I personally am a big lover of the Ziploc bag. I use plastic. I think what I hope comes through in this book, and what I was really reinforced for me in the writing, is that we can do what we can as individuals, but this is a systemic problem, and it was a problem that was deliberately created. Not that essentially anyone foresaw the scale of plastic waste we're experiencing now, in which we are likely all breathing microplastic particles at this moment. But an industry that makes a material that lasts forever has to find a way to make it disposable so they can make more. And that was a very conscious, one of the industry executives way back in the 50s said the future of plastic is in the garbage can. And people who had been used to conserving during World War II and the Depression were saving their plastic cups and their styrofoam coffee cups. And so people had to be trained and educated to throw plastic away. So this was a very deliberate, and it's also was a very deliberate movement within the industry to hold people responsible for the individuals responsible for this waste. So again, way back in the 1950s, a town in Vermont, Go Progressive Vermont, put a ban on single-use items, one of the first ever, and the packaging industry and Coca-Cola were instantly on that. And their response, one of their responses, they've had many over the 6 decades since, but one was to start an anti-pollution campaign called Keep America Beautiful. Those of us who are 50 like me and older probably remember the so-called crying Indian, who was not actually an indigenous person. And the tagline for that campaign was, "People start pollution, people can stop it." So it was literally turning our gaze away from the corporations, and it has made it hard for us to even conceive of something that's actually basic common sense, which is that companies should be responsible for the waste that they create, right? They should need to take responsibility for that. That's nowhere been in our consideration of our economy. Economists call that an externality because companies don't have to deal with the cost. And the scale of our plastic waste problem now is changing that. So I want people to go and clean up beaches and to worry about their plastic waste. And I want them to tell companies to change, because we can't just do it by ourselves, and we shouldn't have to. And that was you mentioned the Honda Odyssey, right? That was one of the whole sort of points of the book. It starts and ends there. I found this big plastic car part, and I would show it to you, but I'm not home right now, unfortunately. It's at my house, but it's this big 4-foot, not very beautiful thing, black. And I discovered after some research that it came from a Honda Odyssey, which as a poet was great news for me. Odyssey, so poetic. And I ended up going with my family on a road trip across the country to the Honda Odyssey plant in Lincoln, Alabama, where every Honda Odyssey on the planet is made. And in this sort of gimmick to get them to take this car part back, they build themselves as a zero waste factory. So our goal was to deliver it, and it was delivered in a very charming way by my 8-year-old daughter, asking them if they could take this plastic piece of garbage back. And of course they did not want to take that piece of plastic back. And the very last line in the book, which the Honda representative so generously gave me, was handing that plastic piece back to my 8-year-old and saying, "That's yours." And that to me was such a symbolic moment of what we're doing with all this plastic waste and giving it to a next generation. But it's really the corporations that we need to hold to account. And the good news is that this is not there are people thinking about this. And in fact, there is a bill in Congress right now introduced by my own senator from Oregon, Senator Jeff Merkley, called the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act. And one of the things it would do, 3 main things. One is put a moratorium on new plastic plants anywhere in the country until they sort out this pollution problem. Because right now plants get a permit to pollute in isolation. They don't look at cumulative pollution, right? And in communities that are already dying from pollution, that can't be a thing. So it puts a moratorium on those plants. And it actually really is powerfully paradigm shifting, because it would hold corporations responsible for dealing with their waste. So our taxpayer money, we pay for recycling, we do what we can. That would all be corporations that have to be responsible for that. And as you can imagine, the industry hates this. Before the bill was even introduced, the American Chemistry Council had a press conference saying it should be dead on arrival. And it seems they're one of the biggest lobbyists in Washington. It seems to have kind of worked. The bill has dropped out of the media, and then there's no vote scheduled. Same thing happened to this bill last year. So if folks can, talk to their congresspeople and tell them that they support this kind of thing, I think that would be a powerful gesture. The book doesn't take a political stance in that way, but I hope that it galvanizes people to at least look into it and ask.
Can you repeat the name of the bill?
Yeah, I don't know if I could talk. It's the Break Free. I know it's Break Free from Plastic Act. That's what it means. Break Free from Plastic. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, we have our first question from Cobalt Koi. And they ask, Allison, can you share about how you found your way around the complex web of connections in your book?
That's a nice question. By feel. Really, from one path to another. And really, so much of it was about people, like my friend and colleague who lives in Houston named Alan West introduced me to a scholar and writer named Irene Vasquez, who is the one who introduced me to the indigenous scholar Eve Tuck, who pioneered desire-centered research. So really, I just benefited from, and you will see if you read the book, there's a very long acknowledgement section in the back. I really just benefited from the generosity and wisdom of people who were willing to guide me. That's how I found my way.
Great. Somebody says in the chat that it's great to hear this book out loud. And Susan Middleton actually also says it's great to see and hear you. And so as I wait for another question, I'm just going to ask a kind of crafting question. Do you read aloud as you write your prose? And how does that shape or change how you write?
I do read aloud, and it probably makes me slow because it's a prose book, so it takes a long time to read out loud. But as a poet too, Camille, I don't know if you do this, but I always read my poetry out loud, and I just I'm so attuned to sound and want it to sound good. And so I do, even when I'm trying to impart information, I'm attuned to sound. So I do read aloud. I also compose really physically, probably because I just lack the knowledge of the software that I would need. But the book, as you mentioned, is enormous. It has it's not enormous, but it has a lot of different threads. And so the way that I managed that was literally to just put the pages of the book up on the wall. Yes, I know the irony of this. I used styrofoam insulation panels on my wall. So I partook of plastic technology to hang the pages of the book. And then I could literally just physically see where the different threads and themes were. And I could think about moving them around and shaping the book that way. So yeah, it's physical, it's verbal, it's all that stuff.
Great. All right, the questions are rolling in now. Our beloved Brian Tier wants to know, could you talk about the role of apology and trust in the book? I'm thinking about both in the context of friendship and in the context of activist communities. Yeah.
So there's a moment in the book. Well, there are two sort of moments of apology in the book. One is that part of the chronicle of the book is my dear friend Yukio Kawano, who is a third generation survivor of the Hiroshima bombing. So she and I are about the same age. Her grandparents on both sides of her family survived the Hiroshima atomic bombing, and she's a gorgeous visual artist, Yukio Kawano. She uses kimonos that her grandmother owned vintage kimonos and makes life-size sculptures of the bombs out of these beautiful diaphanous kimonos. I mean, they're just a stunning juxtaposition of like violence and beauty. And she sews them together with her hair. And we have for years collaborated in a performance piece around her visual art and my poetry. And she's one of my dearest friends. And she actually was the one who started asking me about apology and what I thought its utility might be. And we were having, and if I would ever apologize to the people harmed by the technology at Los Alamos. And I did this kind of backtracking thing where I was like, well, I don't even know what kind of apology that would be. That would be like a global apology. Nuclear radiation is global. And where would I start on that? And then I had this moment where I was like, I am looking into the eyes of my friend whom I love, and she has been so directly harmed by this technology. And I had a moment where I was like, Yukio, I'm sorry. And I chronicled that in the book. And it was a powerful moment for both of us. And I think it deepened trust between us. We do cross a cultural gulf, you know, and it's Yukio who does most of the translating, right? Yukio lives in this country. She speaks the language. She speaks my native language. She's doing more of the work. And I think there was a moment where Yukio did not offer forgiveness, but she offered love and caring in return, and also recognition of her own complicity and her culture's complicity, because Japan was such a brutal aggressor during World War II. And that has directly impacted people she knows in her life. So that was a powerful moment where we were both holding complexity and the ability to kind of deepen trust in that way. Now, that is a special relationship, right? Because apology, I started looking into apologies then, and there's a scholar, a sociologist of apology, who says that apology is a long-term commitment, which I just loved, you know, and Yukio said that to me too. She said, well, what if it doesn't make anything happen right away? What if it's just kind of a way of being kind of apology? And I think I started really to learn what that might mean. There's another moment where I apologize in the book ineffectively to one of the residents of Mossville, Louisiana, which is a community that was wiped out by a plastic plant. And that was one of the people who didn't want to talk to me. It was like, I've talked to a lot of you people and you've done nothing for us. We are dying. And I was not able to offer the same kind of apology to her because I couldn't offer her anything. I couldn't offer her reparations. I couldn't offer her a lifetime commitment because we didn't have that trust relationship. So it was a powerful lesson for me in terms of how we can be with each other and what it requires, really what apology requires in a fundamental way.
I want you to know, Allison, that not very long ago, I moderated a mediation between two fifth graders. And I began this mediation with the 3 R's of apology that I learned from your book, which you learned from that other book. And it was really useful, right? These kind of 3 cents where you have to take responsibility, you have to really respond, and you have to also have reparations and have that's a radically important way of thinking about apology, and as an active and ongoing commitment. So my family, and thanks you.
I'm so glad you said that because my 4th grader says, I'm sorry all the time, as a I'm sorry. And then we say to her, well, the sorry is not what we're looking for. We're looking for behavior change. But it didn't occur to me to do the 3 R's with her.
There you go. It worked in the 5th grade. I don't know if it works in the 4th, but we have a few more questions and we're coming up on time. So I want to make sure to get to a couple more of them. One of them is who are other documentary poets and prose writers that have shaped your writing?
So many. That's such a great question. Thank you, Stephen. And it's lovely to see Stephen Vincent is here, and Yukio, who I just spoke with, is here. Such a generous friend to me. I love Susan Howe, the poet and essayist Susan Howe, who writes about U.S. history in really complex ways, and also is just like also at the same time writes gorgeous lyric poetry, like unabashedly beautiful lyrics, and combines the two. So that reading Susan Howe kind of early in my career as a writer, I felt gave me a lot of freedom. I also really admire the work of naturalist writers like Helen Mcdonald, who's an essayist. People might know her book H is for Hawk, and she has a new book, Vesper Flight, who's just a gorgeous writer and also incredibly astute and smart. So I love to follow, you know, what she's doing in her work, and just kind of aspire to be such a gorgeous and knowledgeable writer. So that is another person I admire. Claudia Rankin, who writes in what people might call prose poems, and writes about, you know, social issues and Blackness and race, but in a way that is just also gorgeous and perfectly attuned to an ear. I mean, unless you read her work out loud, you could almost miss it because it's very subtle, but she's such a beautiful writer, writing about these issues. Those have been kind of three of my, I'd say, core models.
I just want to point out that Cobalt has generously added Yukio's website in the chat. So for those of you who want to see these beautiful pieces of art, the website for that link is in the chat. And so I think we have two more questions that I see here. One is from Tracy Zeman. Can you talk about the dynamic between women and men in the book? You seem to intentionally describe the women who were involved in these stories that on the surface in history belonged to men. And that's a great question, because it really does feel like a book that's paying attention to unburying some erased stories.
Yes. Yeah. Hi, Tracy. Thanks for asking that. That was another sort of moment in the writing of the book that set me off on a different trajectory, because I had a moment where I realized that I had been doing all of this research and writing into this history of this technology, chemistry, military, World War II technology, all the development of plastic. And I sat down to try to make something coherent about all this research, and realized that I had blanked out a lot of the women. I had left a lot of the women out of the book. The photographer, Susan Middleton, who is here, was a key figure in the book, and was there through her generosity, because she talked with me and met with me. But there were women historical figures that were gone. And that really woke me up, because that's also a self-erasure, right? Like, I don't belong in those histories then either. And so I did do a very conscious excavation work in terms of going back and placing the women in those histories. And that's difficult, because a lot of them are lost in the historical record. Some have been recovered, but some have deliberately stepped out of history. There's a woman, Lisa Meitner, who was a Jewish Austrian physicist who decided not to pursue work on the atomic bomb after she basically discovered the phenomenon of fission, and she dropped out of history because of that and for other reasons. So that was a really important excavation work for me to do personally, and a little bit enraging, because I kept doing it over and over again. I kept erasing the women and then having to walk back and uncover what I'd done. So
you may or may not know this also, but when I got to that part about Lisa Meitner, I immediately texted the poet Erica Meitner, and I said, "Do you know of this woman?" And she is a direct relation of the poet Erica Meitner. And Erica said that when she was in high school, her own high school physics teacher was sorely disappointed in Erica, because she's a poet, not a physicist, not a Nobel Prize level physicist. But yes, so you should have a conversation sometime with Erica Meitner about
another connection.
relative.
See, the book never ends. It just keeps being written as a life, right? I'm sure you have that experience too.
Well, and for me, it was just this really exciting thing, because I kept coming on these where I would find a connection. I'd say in my blurb, this book is our whole lives, right? Like, there's a way in which this book just seems to really, in the most unlikely places, show me my connection to these stories that are all of our story. So I feel like I'm going to ask this last question that's in the chat, and then I want to close with another final question before we let everybody go. But this is a really important question from Margaret Hinkles. And the question is that please expand about how natural gas is driving the expansion of the plastic industry. And maybe you can talk a little bit about the exports of liquefied gas and et cetera to sort of explain what's all going on there.
Yes, thank you for asking that, Margaret, who was a colleague of mine at Environmental Defense Fund. So she knows the importance of making clear what these issues are about. But so plastic is essentially made from natural gas, components of natural gas. And there's so much natural gas being produced by fracking that it is very low in price. And that's made energy costs go down as pollution goes up. And it has also made this huge glut of basically the raw material for plastic sitting out there on the market waiting to be used. And so companies can take this very cheap raw ingredient and turn it into something that brings them a big profit. So that's why companies are building all of these new plastic plants to take advantage. They call it a feedstock. It's the raw material for plastic to take advantage of this very cheap raw material that they can then profit from. So that is really what is driving that expansion. The same glut of natural gas is also driving the expansion of Camille, what you mentioned, something called liquefied natural gas plants. So the US used to be an importer of natural gas. Now, because of fracking, we have the largest oil and gas field on the planet sitting in Texas and New Mexico. It's called the Permian Basin. We are producing so much natural gas from that field that we are now exporting natural gas. And what you have to do is take that gas and turn it into a liquid, which requires all this, making it super cold and all this technology, because a liquid is much easier to ship than a gas. And so that's another huge build out on the coast. So these massive liquid natural gas plants that are also polluting and endangering communities because that's a dangerous process. So it is really just that raw fossil fuel ingredient that's just driving all this buildup. And a huge increase in climate pollution too, by the way, because natural gas is also methane, which is a very powerful climate warming gas. So it's kind of a triple whammy.
Well, we're at time, and this has been just a wonderful conversation, and I'm really, really grateful to you for this book and what it's taught me, both about like all these aspects of the world and our history, but also the kind of power I think that it can give some of us to maybe work to enact change. My last question is the question, I'm not even going to ask it. It's the question everybody, all the writers dread. So instead, I'm going to ask, what are your hopes for this book? Like, what do you, like, if somebody gave it as a gift to somebody else, what would you hope that gift would offer?
I really want to know what was the other thing you were going to ask now.
Oh, what are you working on now? But we're talking about this book. I will be perfectly honest, Camille. I would like someone to read the book and say what you said about it. That when you read it, that you saw your own connections in it. You saw the ways, you saw your way into it, because that's what I want. I feel so alienated myself by the deluge of information that I deal with every day around the environment. And it is hard. And like you said, you did get stopped. But I want people to see their own way in, because that's what, you know, I think will help us be resilient, find a way forward, move forward. And I will tell you that what I want to be working on, though I am not, because I'm working on work, but when I carve out some time for myself, I really
want to write a book of poetry now. And I want to explore more deeply this issue of grief and joy and desire that I feel like I just have touched the surface on, learning from these activists and other leaders and scholars. And in my own life, my mom dies in the process of writing the book, and the grief and surprisingly joy of that process was something that really shaped both the book and, of course, my own experience. And I feel like, poetry is as Audre Lorde said, it's the way that we understand what we feel so that we can understand what we think, so we understand what we know, so we know what to do. And I feel like this is a task for poetry now, that I want to dwell in that space a little bit. So that's my goal.
Wonderful. Well, if you who are watching have not yet had an opportunity to purchase this book, please do so. Point Reyes Bookstore has a link at the top of this chat, and I bet Emily would be happy to put one in again. And thank you for joining us on this Monday evening.
Yeah, thank you, Camille.
Jump in, and thank you both for such a amazing conversation. If anyone wants to rewatch or share with their friends, it'll be available on this Crowdcast page, or we'll also put it up on our YouTube channel in a few days. And yes, please buy the book. I feel like if you were not convinced by this conversation, but thank you both, and have a good night.
Thank you, Emily.
Thank you.
Thanks, Claudia.